A broken dog, a broken man, and a story that will touch your heart. Max wasn't just a rescue. He became a symbol of hope. Watch how one powerful bond turned pain into strength. This isn't just a rescue story. It's the beginning of a new life. The small town of Maplebrook had always been quiet, its streets lined with modest homes and surrounded by sprawling farmlands. To anyone passing through, it might have seemed like a perfect place, a safe haven. But for Daniel, a man with a troubled past, it had become a sanctuary. It was here, in this town, where he had started over, leaving behind the city's chaos and his own shattered memories. Daniel had opened a small animal rescue shop on the edge of Maplebrook, a place that had once been an old barn. He had poured his heart into it, every inch of the space now a refuge for abandoned animals. The shop, which he named Buddy's Haven, was filled with cages, dog beds, and toys scattered across the floor. The walls were lined with posters of animals looking for homes, and the air smelled faintly of wood and fresh air. It wasn't much, but it was his. The shop had become his reason to get up in the morning. But even in this quiet corner of the world, the shadows of his past lingered. He had lost so much before. A failed marriage, a career that had left him empty. But it was the loss of his own sense of purpose that had been the hardest to bear. The rescue animals at the shop were his new family, and each day he worked to heal their broken spirits, just as he was trying to heal his own. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. One rainy evening, as Daniel was closing the shop for the night, a truck pulled up outside. The sound of tires skimming through the wet roads echoed through the quiet. Daniel glanced out the window, wondering who it could be. He didn't get many visitors after hours. The truck's headlights briefly illuminated the sign outside before the engine cut off, and the door opened. A man stepped out, a large, intimidating figure who appeared to be in his 40s. His clothes were worn, his face etched with lines of hard living. In his hands, he held a large crate, and Daniel could make out the faint sounds of whimpering from within. The man walked up to the door and knocked. Daniel hesitated for a moment. He hadn't been expecting anyone, but he opened the door anyway. The man didn't waste time with small talk. "I need to get rid of this dog," he said gruffly, pushing the crate toward Daniel. "He's no good. Too much trouble. You'll take him, right?" Daniel's brow furrowed, confused by the suddenness of the encounter. He had seen plenty of abandoned animals, but there was something different about this one. Something in the man's voice that made him uneasy. "Let me take a look," Daniel said, trying to keep his tone calm. The man scoffed. "No time for looking. Just take him. If you don't, I'll just let him go." Daniel's instincts flared. This wasn't right. He knew that look. The man wasn't just trying to get rid of the dog. He was trying to erase the evidence of something. But there was no time to second guess. With a heavy sigh, Daniel moved aside to allow the man to pass. The crate was placed gently on the floor, and Daniel bent down to open it. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. Inside the crate lay a dog, curled up in a ball, shivering. His coat was matted and stained, his ribs clearly visible beneath his fur. The dog's eyes were wide with fear, and he didn't make a sound. He barely moved. Daniel's heart ached at the sight of the poor animal. He had seen many abused and neglected creatures in his years of rescuing, but this one was different. It was as if the dog had given up on life, resigned to whatever fate had brought him here. The man didn't seem to notice or care. He was already turning to leave. "I'll take care of it," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken resolve. "Good," the man muttered, slamming the door behind him. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at the dog. something deep within him stirred. He had dealt with animals who had been mistreated, but this one felt personal. This dog had endured something worse than abandonment. He had been broken. The dog's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment Daniel felt a silent understanding between them. It was a look of shared pain, of trauma that couldn't be erased easily, but it was also a look of something else, a flicker of hope. Daniel gently knelt beside the crate, reaching his hand toward the dog. "Hey, buddy," he whispered softly. "You're safe now. I won't let them hurt you anymore." The dog didn't respond, but Daniel didn't need a response. He could feel the quiet weight of the dog's sorrow, the layers of abuse that had been etched into his very being. But Daniel was determined. He had rescued many animals before, but this one was different. He would make it right. He carefully lifted the dog from the crate and cradled him in his arms. The dog was stiff, but he didn't fight. He simply allowed Daniel to carry him to the back of the shop, where a comfortable bed awaited. "Rest now," Daniel said softly as he laid the dog down. "We'll take it one day at a time." As the dog curled up on the bed, Daniel stood there, watching him. He knew that the journey ahead would be long. It wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And that hope would soon lead to something neither of them could have ever predicted. The following days were quiet but intense. Daniel knew that the journey ahead would be challenging. The dog, whom he had begun to think of as Max, though the name hadn't been given to him by anyone, hadn't made a sound since his arrival. It was as though the animal had retreated entirely into himself, too scared to even respond to the simple acts of kindness Daniel extended. Each morning, Daniel would check on him, offering food, water, and gentle affection. Max barely moved from his spot, and every time Daniel approached, the dog would flinch, his body trembling. Daniel wasn't sure how to break through. He had dealt with animals who had been mistreated, yes, but Max felt like something else, something deeper. His eyes, though filled with sadness, held a haunting depth, as though he had seen too much for any creature to bear. One afternoon, after Daniel had cleaned the shop and sat down for a rare moment of rest, he heard a small noise. It was faint, like a low whimper. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the back room where Max was resting. He found the dog in the same spot, but his eyes were open now, watching Daniel with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said softly, kneeling beside him. "How are you doing?" Max didn't respond. He remained still, his eyes locked on Daniel's with an almost fearful gaze. But there was something else there too, an unwillingness to trust, yet a desperate need for connection. Daniel reached out slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might scare him. "You're safe here. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Max's body tensed at the words, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought the dog might retreat into himself once more. But then, as if by some silent agreement, Max took a hesitant step forward, his paws slightly shaking. Daniel smiled, feeling a small wave of victory. "That's it. We're going to take this slow, okay?" It wasn't much, but it was a sign. Max was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, he was finally in a place where he wouldn't be hurt anymore. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Max began to adjust. He would follow Daniel around the shop, staying a few steps behind, his movements cautious but curious. The dog still flinched at loud noises and seemed reluctant to let anyone get too close, but he was learning to trust. Max had been broken, yes, but he wasn't beyond repair. Daniel had seen enough miracles in his years working with animals to know that healing was always possible. It just took time. Daniel continued his routine, caring for the other animals at Buddy's Haven, but he made sure to give Max the special attention he needed. It wasn't just about physical care. It was about rebuilding the dog's spirit, helping him find his confidence again. Daniel would take Max on long walks through the town, always staying at a gentle pace. They'd wander around the outskirts of the town, watching the sun set together. Just the two of them. Sometimes, Daniel would sit on a bench, his legs stretched out, with Max resting at his feet. It was peaceful, and it was in these quiet moments that Daniel began to see something in Max that wasn't there before. The dog's eyes, once full of fear, were beginning to soften. There was a flicker of curiosity in his gaze now, and occasionally Daniel would catch him wagging his tail slightly when a new person walked by the shop. One afternoon, as Daniel was talking to a woman about adopting a kitten, Max did something that shocked him. The woman had walked toward the entrance, and without thinking, Max stood up and trotted over to her, his tail wagging cautiously. Daniel watched, heart in his throat, as Max paused just a few feet away from the woman, sniffing the air. "Well, aren't you brave?" the woman said softly, crouching down to pet him. Max flinched initially, but then allowed her hand to gently graze his fur. He didn't back away. Daniel couldn't believe it. Max was actually trusting someone other than him. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said quietly, walking up behind Max. "Looks like you're making some new friends." Max turned to look at him for a moment, as if to say, "I'm okay now." Then, with a final glance at the woman, Max padded back to his spot in the corner of the room, lying down again. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was a small step, but it was monumental. For the first time in his life, Daniel understood the true meaning of patience. That evening, after closing time, Daniel sat on the floor next to Max, who was curled up in his bed. He placed a hand gently on the dog's head. "You've come a long way, Max," Daniel murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We both have." As the days passed, Max continued to grow stronger. His tail began to wag more frequently, and his eyes sparkled with a cautious optimism that Daniel had never seen before. There was no telling what the future held for them, but for the first time since his arrival, Daniel felt certain of one thing. Max was ready to move forward. Max was healing, and soon he would do something that no one could have expected. Not even Daniel. Weeks passed, and the little community surrounding Buddy's Haven continued to grow. Word of Max's transformation spread, and more people visited the shop, curious to meet the dog who had survived so much. There were new volunteers, more donations, and even an increase in adoptions. Yet, despite all the attention, Daniel remained focused on the one thing that mattered most: Max's recovery. It had been a little over 2 months since Max had come into Daniel's life, and in that time, Daniel had seen a complete change in the dog. Where there had once been fear and hesitation, there was now cautious curiosity. Max would sit by the door when people came in, watching them with intelligent eyes, and sometimes, even if he didn't approach, he'd allow a few brave visitors to pet him. His tail wagged more often, and he seemed more at ease with the world around him. Daniel couldn't help but marvel at how far Max had come. It was clear to him that Max's journey wasn't just about physical healing. It was about emotional growth. The dog had been broken by abuse, but he was starting to build a new life, step by small step. One evening, as Daniel was closing up the shop after a long day, he noticed something strange. Max, who had been lying in his bed as usual, stood up suddenly, his ears perked. He trotted towards the door, his body tense, eyes scanning the area outside. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't like Max. The dog usually stayed close by in the shop, never venturing far from the security of his familiar surroundings. "Max?" Daniel called, standing up and walking over to him. "What's wrong, boy?" Max continued to stand at the door, sniffing the air and staring out into the growing darkness outside. Daniel felt a pang of unease. It was nearly midnight, and the streets were empty. His gut told him that something wasn't right. Before Daniel could move toward him, Max pushed against the door with his nose, causing it to creak open. Daniel rushed forward, but the dog was already outside, trotting swiftly down the porch steps. "Max!" No exclamation mark, Daniel called, panic rising in his chest. "Come back!" But Max wasn't listening. He moved with a purpose, heading toward the road. Daniel, heart pounding, followed as quickly as he could, yelling for Max to stop. It wasn't like the dog to act out like this. Max had always been cautious, even now when he was more comfortable in his own skin. "Max, stop!" Daniel shouted again, but the dog was resolute, continuing down the quiet street. Suddenly, from the shadows ahead, Daniel heard a voice. A man's voice. His stomach dropped, and he felt a chill run down his spine. "Hey, what's going on here?" the voice called out. Daniel froze, recognizing the man's silhouette. It was Alan. Alan, the very man who had once owned Max, the man who had tortured him, the man who had left Max to rot in a dark corner for so long. Daniel's heart sank as the realization hit him. Max had recognized Alan's scent. "Max, get back here!" Daniel shouted, his voice shaking with anger and fear. He couldn't let Max near that monster again, not after everything they had been through. But Max didn't listen. The dog walked toward Alan, his tail stiff behind him. Daniel rushed forward, panic making his legs feel like lead, but before he could reach them, something remarkable happened. Max stopped just a few feet away from Alan. For a moment, the two locked eyes, and then something extraordinary unfolded. The dog, who had once been broken, who had lived in fear for so long, suddenly did something that surprised everyone. Max growled. It wasn't a normal growl. It was deep, guttural, filled with the kind of anger that only someone who had suffered could know. Max stood firm, his body tense, every muscle locked in place. The sound came from deep inside him, a growl that held years of pain, years of silent suffering. Alan froze. For a brief moment there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, guilt, or perhaps fear. But whatever it was, it didn't last long. Max stepped forward, his growl growing louder, the sound echoing off the walls of the surrounding buildings. Alan took a hesitant step back. "What's the matter with you?" he sneered, but there was no conviction in his words. The fear in his eyes was clear now. Daniel arrived just in time to see Max stand his ground. He couldn't believe it. Max, the broken dog who had once been unable to even look at a person without trembling, was now protecting himself. He was standing up for himself. For the first time, Max wasn't the victim. He was the hero. "Stay back, Alan," Daniel shouted, his voice shaking with fury. "You don't get to hurt him anymore." Alan scowled but didn't move closer. "He's just a dog," he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration and something darker. Fear. Max's growl intensified. His body quivered with a mixture of rage and triumph. He was no longer a prisoner of his past. He had broken free, and this man, his abuser, was no longer in control. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. Max standing tall, his growl echoing through the night, and Alan backing away slowly, his bravado gone. Finally, Alan turned and fled into the darkness, disappearing down the street. Max stood there for a long time, watching the spot where Alan had vanished. His tail began to wag slowly, cautiously, as if he were processing the victory. Daniel slowly approached, kneeling beside the dog. "You did it," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it, Max." Max turned to him, his eyes softening. the growl fading into a quiet sigh. For the first time in months, Max rested his head on Daniel's knee, his body still, but at peace. As they stood together in the quiet night, Daniel realized that this was more than just a victory for Max. It was a victory for them both. Max had faced his past, stood up to his abuser, and come out on top. But the true miracle was the dog's ability to heal. Max had gone from broken and scared to strong and unafraid. And Daniel knew that the journey wasn't over. There was still so much more to come. The aftermath of that night changed everything. Alan's sudden appearance and the encounter with Max had sent shockwaves through Daniel's life. Though the man had disappeared into the shadows, the tension lingered, haunting Daniel in ways he hadn't expected. But more importantly, Max had done something incredible, something that spoke volumes about his resilience and the silent courage he had been harboring all along. Daniel spent the following days watching Max carefully, studying how the dog moved through the world now. It wasn't just about physical healing anymore. It was about trust. Max had learned, in his quiet, brave way, to trust again. He had faced the man who had broken him and come out stronger. But what did that mean for their future? Could Max ever fully heal from what had been done to him? And could Daniel continue to provide the safe space Max needed, knowing that the shadows of Alan's cruelty still hung over them? It was a quiet Sunday morning when Daniel's question was answered, albeit in the most unexpected way. Max had always been a creature of habit. He woke early, spent the morning walking with Daniel, and then lay on his bed or beside the counter while Daniel tended to the shop. But this morning, something was different. Max had become restless, pacing the floor, his eyes darting toward the door. He was acting like he had something important to say. Daniel smiled, ruffling Max's ears. "What's on your mind, buddy? You seem like you're waiting for something." Max responded with a soft whine, his gaze fixed on the door, as if there were something or someone out there calling to him. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what was going on, but the intensity of Max's attention was impossible to ignore. Curious, Daniel decided to step outside and see what had gotten Max so riled up. He opened the door, and Max bounded forward, his tail wagging, but with a focus that seemed beyond simple excitement. It was as if he was searching for something, or someone. Daniel followed him out into the yard, watching as Max moved toward the edge of the property. "What is it, Max?" Daniel asked softly, though he wasn't sure what he was expecting. The dog had already shown so much bravery in the past weeks, but this new energy, this sense of purpose, felt different. As Max moved further into the yard, Daniel's eyes caught something. A figure was standing at the edge of the property, just outside the fence. It was a man, tall, with broad shoulders and a familiar gait. Daniel's heart leaped into his chest. It was Evan. "Evan?" Daniel called, his voice thick with emotion. He hadn't seen the boy in weeks. The last time he had visited, he had been recovering from the trauma of his past, so broken, so lost. But now, there he stood, looking calm, even peaceful. Max, for his part, trotted toward Evan without hesitation, his tail wagging furiously. The moment they saw each other, it was as if the bond that had been slowly forming between them clicked into place. Evan knelt down, his hands outstretched, and Max practically leaped into his arms. Daniel stood still, watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of awe. This was the boy who had been too afraid to trust anyone, even the people who had shown him kindness. And now, here he was, reaching out to the dog who had been through hell and back, offering him the same love and trust that Max had given Daniel. Evan looked up at Daniel, his eyes shining with something he hadn't seen in the boy before. Hope. I couldn't stop thinking about Max, Evan stammered, his voice breaking slightly. I didn't know if he'd remember me, or if he'd be afraid, but I had to see him again. He paused, struggling to find the words. He saved me. He helped me feel safe. I owe him everything. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he walked over to them. He crouched down beside Evan and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Max is a hero, no doubt, Daniel said softly. But you saved him too. You gave him a chance to trust again, and now he's giving that back to you. Evan nodded, wiping his eyes. I don't know if I would have made it without him, Daniel. I really don't. Max, seemingly content in Evan's arms, turned his head to look at Daniel, his eyes soft and trusting. Daniel couldn't help but smile. Max had always been the one to teach him about loyalty, love, and second chances, but today he was teaching Evan the same lessons. It was as if Max understood that his purpose wasn't just to heal himself. It was to heal the people around him too. From that day on, Max became a bridge between Daniel and Evan. It was clear that the bond between the dog and the boy was something special, something neither of them had expected. They spent their days together, walking through the property, playing, and helping with the rescue efforts at Buddy's Haven. Max, who had once been so fearful of people, now became a quiet symbol of hope for Evan. He showed the boy how to trust again, how to let go of the past and move forward with courage. In return, Evan gave Max the same love and care that Daniel had shown him. There was something healing in their bond, something unspoken but powerful. And it wasn't just Max who was healing. It was everyone who came into contact with him. The more people saw how a dog who had been mistreated and abandoned could find love, the more they believed in second chances. It was a small, quiet revolution. And it all started with one dog and one man, two souls bound by trauma, but united in their determination to heal. It had been 2 years since Max had first come into Daniel's life. 2 years filled with heartbreak, healing, and moments of quiet joy. The journey had been long, and at times it felt like it would never end. But now, standing at the edge of Buddy's Haven, watching Max run freely across the yard, Daniel realized that this was just the beginning. Max had become more than just a rescue dog. He had become the heart of the place. Buddy's Haven had grown over the past few months, thanks to the influx of donations, volunteers, and the increasing number of people who were inspired by Max's story. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a sanctuary, a place where healing happened not only for the animals but for the people, too. But as much as things had changed, the deep scars from Max's past still lingered. Daniel knew that. He saw it in Max's eyes from time to time, those moments when something triggered a memory and the dog would freeze, his body tense, his ears pressed flat against his head. It was a subtle shift, but it never escaped Daniel's notice. Still, Max had come so far. He no longer cowered at sudden movements, and his tail never stopped wagging. His relationship with Evan had blossomed into something that neither of them could have imagined when they first met. Evan had grown stronger, more confident, and had begun to heal in ways that were unimaginable before Max's arrival. The boy who once feared his own shadow was now a constant presence at the shelter, working alongside Daniel and helping other animals find their way to a better life. On a bright Saturday morning, when the sun was shining down and the warmth of spring filled the air, Daniel and Evan were preparing for the adoption event they had planned for weeks. It was a special day, the first time they were officially opening Buddy's Haven to the public as a fully operational sanctuary. There were families arriving, eager to meet the dogs and cats that had come to rely on Buddy's Haven for safety and love. Max was, of course, the star of the event. He greeted each visitor with a wagging tail and an enthusiastic bark, but he never strayed far from Daniel's side. They were inseparable now, a duo forged in fire, and it was clear to everyone who saw them together that their bond was unbreakable. As the event progressed, Daniel saw the same look on the faces of the families who came to meet Max, a mix of admiration, awe, and wonder. Max's story had become legend in their small town, and many came hoping to meet the dog who had survived so much. As one woman approached the yard, holding her young daughter's hand, Daniel felt a shift in the air. The woman had heard the story, and her eyes were full of tears as she approached. "You must be Daniel," she said softly, her voice shaking. I just wanted to thank you for what you've done, for Max, for giving him a chance. We needed to hear his story. It gave us the courage to do what we couldn't before." Daniel stood still for a moment, not fully understanding the depth of her words. "I'm just glad Max could help. He's the real hero." The woman smiled, her eyes bright with emotion. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You don't understand. My husband. He was abusive. I left him with nothing but my daughter and my dog. We've been living in shelters, trying to survive, but hearing Max's story gave me the strength to do what I needed to do for us. It showed me that we could start over, that we could be safe." Daniel's heart swelled with emotion. He had never imagined that Max's story would inspire someone so profoundly. The dog had given this woman the strength to leave an abusive situation and to rebuild her life. He had done for her what Daniel had done for Max, offered a second chance. "Max gave you strength," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you gave yourself the courage to leave. You did that." The woman nodded, holding her daughter close. "We're starting fresh today, and it's all because of Max." Max, hearing his name, trotted over to the woman and her daughter, sitting at their feet and looking up at them with his soulful eyes. The little girl reached down to pet him, and Max leaned into the touch, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Daniel stepped back, allowing the family to have a moment of quiet connection. He watched as the woman stroked Max's fur, her smile widening as the dog leaned in to her touch. For the first time, he realized just how far Max had come. Not just for himself, but for others too. The day continued, and more families visited. The animals at Buddy's Haven were adopted into loving homes, and Daniel couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The place had grown into something more than a shelter. It had become a lifeline. The work they were doing, the lives they were changing, it was all part of a much bigger mission. As the event wound down and the sun began to set, Daniel sat on a bench outside the shelter, Max by his side. Evan walked over and joined him, his eyes full of satisfaction and contentment. "We did it, didn't we?" he said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, we did." Max laid his head on Daniel's lap, his body relaxed and at peace. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. He had found his way to a new beginning, just as Daniel had. And together they had built something lasting, a place where hope wasn't just a word, but a reality. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Daniel felt a quiet peace settle over him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, there would be setbacks, and there would always be reminders of the past. But he also knew that with Max by his side, they could face whatever came next. "Max," Daniel whispered softly, his voice thick with emotion, "you've shown me what it means to be brave, and because of you, I'll never stop fighting for the second chances we all deserve." Max's tail wagged, a quiet promise in the night air that they would face everything together, as they always had.